Hey guys, welcome back to the Atlas Archives. I'm so glad you're here, and I hope wherever you're listening from you've got the lights low and something comfortable to lie on because we are going deep tonight. Tonight's country is Namibia, and before we get into it, I want to tell you one thing that I think sets the tone for this entire episode. Namibia is the second least densely populated country on Earth. Not second in Africa, second on the planet. The only country with fewer people per square kilometre is Mongolia. We're talking about a place the size of France, Spain and Portugal combined roughly 824,000 square kilometres, and it has about 3 million people. For context, the Greater Sydney area has about the same population, tucked into a fraction of the space. In Namibia, you can drive for 4 hours and not see another car. You can stand on a ridge in the desert and watch the sun set over dunes that stretch to the horizon in every direction, and there is no one else there. Just you, the wind, and a landscape so old it makes human history feel like a rounding error. That age is the other thing. The Namib Desert, the one the country is named after, is widely considered the oldest desert on Earth. We're not talking a few thousand years. We're talking somewhere between 55 and 80 million years. There are fossils in those dunes from animals that no longer exist anywhere else on the planet. There are plants growing in the Namib that have been alive for over 1,000 years and belong to a lineage that hasn't meaningfully changed since the Jurassic period. The dinosaurs were still around when the ancestors of these plants first appeared. This is the kind of place we're dealing with tonight. Drop a comment and tell me where you're listening from. I love seeing those come in. And if you're not subscribed yet, now is a very good time, because this one is going to be a long and deeply strange journey. Namibia has everything. Ancient peoples, colonial horror, independent struggles, ghost towns being eaten by sand, coastlines that sailors named the gates of hell. We'll get to all of it. But first, we start where we always start, with the land itself. Dim the lights, get comfortable, let's go. Chapter 1. The land that forgot about water. Let's start with a fact that sounds like a joke but isn't. Namibia is the driest country in sub-Saharan Africa. Not one of the driest. The driest. In a continent that contains the Sahara, the Kalahari, and large portions of terrain that look like the surface of Mars, Namibia took one look at all of that and said, "Hold my beer." Some parts of the country receive less than 13 millimeters of rain per year. That's not per month, that's per year. 13 millimeters. You could absorb that with a medium-sized sponge. And yet, and this is the part that will keep coming up tonight, life has found a way. Spectacularly, stubbornly, sometimes absurdly, life has found a way. To understand Namibia, you need to understand that it is essentially 3 different countries, stitched together by an accident of colonial cartography. And each of those countries operates under completely different physical rules. On the west, you've got the coast and the Namib Desert. In the middle, a broad highland plateau. To the east, the Kalahari. And then, poking out of the northeast corner like someone forgot to tuck it in, a narrow finger of land called the Caprivi Strip that is so geographically different from the rest of the country it might as well be part of Central Africa. We'll get to that. But let's start at the coast, because that's where things get genuinely weird. Imagine you're standing on the beach somewhere along Namibia's Atlantic coastline. It's midday, the sun is blazing, you're in Africa, and you are cold. Not just a little chilly properly cold, the kind that makes you go looking for a jacket. This is the Benguela Current's doing. It's a massive stream of frigid water that flows northward up the coast from the Antarctic, and it keeps the ocean temperature here somewhere between 10 and 15 degrees Celsius year-round. That is swimming pool in winter cold. That is, I did not come to Africa for this cold. And because cold ocean meets hot desert air, the result is fog. Dense, persistent, rolling fog that can blanket hundreds of kilometers of coastline for large portions of the year. The sun doesn't burn it off until mid-morning, sometimes not until noon. Some days it doesn't burn off at all. This fog turns out to be extremely important, and not just for the atmosphere. The Namib Desert itself, the one the country is named after, the one that stretches along the entire western coast, gets somewhere around 0.5 centimetre of actual rainfall per year in its driest parts. But the fog rolls in off the ocean almost every night, carrying moisture with it, and the entire Namib ecosystem has quietly organised itself around that fact. There are beetles here that do a headstand in the fog, collecting water droplets on their backs and letting them roll down toward their mouths. There are lichens that cover the gravel plains and exist entirely on atmospheric moisture, no rain required. And there is one plant, we will get to this plant, that has been alive for over 1,000 years and drinks exclusively from the fog. The Namib doesn't wait for rain, it has other arrangements. The name Namib, for the record, comes from the Nama language and means something like an area where there is nothing. The people who lived near it gave it that name, which is honestly fair. Inland temperatures in the Namib can exceed 50 degrees Celsius during the day and drop below zero at night. The central portion is dominated by what's called the Namib Sand Sea, a UNESCO World Heritage Site, and the largest expanse of towering sand dunes on Earth, with the possible exception of certain regions of Mars, which a scenic flight pilot apparently mentioned to a passenger once, and I'm choosing to believe that's true. The dunes are made of sand that wash down the Orange River from the Kalahari hundreds of kilometers to the southeast, got dumped into the Atlantic, was carried north by ocean currents, deposited on the shore, and then blown inland by the prevailing winds. It has been doing this for millions of years. The result is dunes up to 300 meters tall, which is roughly the height of a 60-story building, coloured a deep brick red from iron oxide in the sand, shifting and rearranging themselves in slow motion across the desert floor. The most famous of these dunes are clustered around a place called Sossusvlei, and they are the kind of thing you see in a photograph and assume has been edited. The colours are too saturated. The shadows are too dramatic. The contrast between the burnt orange dunes and the white clay pans at their base and the electric blue sky above is too perfect to be real. But it is real. And if you go there in the early morning, you can watch the sun come up over the dune crests and paint the whole landscape in shifting shades of amber and copper, while the shadows in the valleys go inky black. One of the most photographed dunes, called Dune 45, gets its name from the fact that it sits at the 45th kilometre of the road leading to the valley. Someone had a very practical morning when they named that one. Near Sossusvlei is a place called Deadvlei. It's a dry clay pan flat, chalk white, that used to be fed by a river. At some point, centuries ago, the river changed course. The camel thorn trees that had grown there, some of them 900 years old, died when the water stopped coming. And because the climate is so incredibly dry, the wood never rotted. The skeletons of these 900-year-old dead trees still stand in the white pan, blackened by the sun, surrounded by red dunes. It is one of the most photographed places in Africa. It also looks like the cover of an album that a very serious band would make. If you've seen it, you know exactly what I mean. Now, before you conclude that the entire Namib coastline is nothing but haunting beauty and existential dread, I should tell you about the Skeleton Coast. This is the northern section of the coastline, running from roughly the Swakop River up to the Angolan border, and it was named by sailors who called it the Gates of Hell. The San people, the indigenous hunter-gatherers who knew this coast better than anyone, had their own name for it, the land God made in anger. Both names are doing a lot of work, and both names are accurate. The Benguela Current doesn't just make the coast cold, it creates some of the most unpredictable and violent ocean conditions on Earth. Ships that got too close to shore in the fog had almost no way to know they were in danger until it was too late. There are roughly 1,000 known shipwrecks along the Skeleton Coast. Some estimates put the true number much higher. The hulks of vessels from multiple centuries, ocean liners, fishing trawlers, small clippers, lie rusting on the beach in various stages of being consumed by sand. Alongside them, historically, were the bones of whales from Namibia's former whaling industry, and the bones of sailors and passengers who didn't make it to shore, hence the name. Standing between the coast and the interior is what's called the Great Escarpment, a dramatic wall of mountains and ridges that rises steeply from the Namib's gravel plains up to the central plateau. The escarpment isn't one continuous cliff face, it's more like a corrugated edge, with isolated mountain massifs, deep gorges, and sudden dramatic drops in elevation. The Brandberg, Namibia's highest peak at 2,573 metres, sits in this zone. As you climb the escarpment, everything changes. The fog gives way to clear air. The temperature range widens dramatically. Plants start to appear in earnest, and by the time you crest the top, you're in a completely different country. The Central Plateau is Namibia's heartland, a broad, elevated tableland running from north to south, sitting between roughly 1,000 and 2,000 metres above sea level. This is where most of the population lives. This is where Windhoek is, the capital, sitting at about 1,700 metres in a pocket of surrounding hills that apparently calls to mind the American Southwest. The plateau is drier than you'd expect for a highland region. Windhoek gets around 340 millimetres of rain per year, which is roughly the same as Perth or Los Angeles. For reference, but compared to the Namib, it's basically a rainforest. Temperatures are more moderate here. There are actual grasses. There are occasional trees. People have farms, though good luck to them, because the soils are sandy and the rainfall is erratic and droughts are part of the long-term plan whether you want them to be or not. East of the plateau, the land slopes down into the Kalahari, which technically extends across 7 countries and covers over 1.2 million square kilometres. And here's the thing about the Kalahari that trips everyone up. It's not technically a desert. Not in the classic sense. It receives too much rain for that up to 500 millimetres a year in some parts. What it is a vast semi-arid savanna, defined by deep red sands, ancient fixed dunes covered in sparse vegetation, acacia trees, and a thirsty grassland that bursts into extraordinary colour after rain. After a good wet season, the Kalahari blooms. The rains apparently have a distinctive smell that people describe as almost electric, like the earth is breathing for the first time in months. Then the dry season comes back, and it's red sand and shimmering heat again for as far as you can see. And then there's the Caprivi Strip. You need to hear about this. The Caprivi Strip is a narrow corridor of land, roughly 450 kilometres long, and sometimes as little as 30 kilometres wide, that juts out from the northeastern corner of Namibia like an afterthought. It borders Angola, Zambia, and Botswana. Its easternmost tip comes within 150 metres of Zimbabwe. This is the result of a colonial deal in 1890, in which Germany negotiated with Britain to get access to the Zambezi River, hoping to use it as a trade route to the east coast of Africa. The Germans got the strip. The plan didn't work out. Victoria Falls, one of the largest waterfalls on Earth, sits about 65 kilometres downstream, which makes the Zambezi magnificently unnavigable as a trade route. Classic colonial planning. Got the land, missed the waterfall on the map. The Caprivi Strip is so different from the rest of Namibia that it feels like a different continent. The Namib is getting 13 millimeters of rain a year. The Caprivi is getting over 600. The coast is a cold fog desert. The Caprivi has lush riverine forests, floodplains, swamps, and a subtropical humidity that would feel deeply out of place anywhere else in the country. Rivers run through it, actual perennial rivers, with water in them all year round, which is a rarity in Namibia, so notable that it bears repeating. African wild dogs move through its corridors. Elephants use it as a pathway between national parks in 4 different countries, and the whole strip was named after Leo von Caprivi, the German chancellor who negotiated the deal. A man who secured a piece of land for access to a river he couldn't use got a 450-kilometre territorial strip named after him, which is a kind of immortality, I suppose, even if it is ironic. Now, if I haven't mentioned the Etosha Pan yet, and I haven't, deliberately because it deserves its own moment, here it is. The Etosha Pan is a vast salt flat in north-central Namibia that covers over 6,000 square kilometres. For most of the year, it's exactly what it sounds like. A flat, blinding white expanse of ancient dried lake bed, baked under the sun, producing heat shimmer and mirages at the edges. Wildlife photographers go there for the extraordinary game, viewing elephants, lions, rhinos, cheetahs, giraffes, and more, all converging on the scattered waterholes that ring the pan as the dry season progresses. When the rains come, however, the pan floods into a shallow lake, flamingos arrive by the tens of thousands, and the entire ecosystem transforms. Then the water evaporates, the flamingos leave, the salt returns. It does this every year, like a biological slot machine pulling the lever on some of the most spectacular wildlife scenes in the world, and then going quiet again. Before we leave the landscape entirely, I want to tell you about the plant, the Welwitschia mirabilis. It lives in the Namib Desert, mostly within about 80 kilometers of the coast where the fog is reliable. It looks, generously, like something that got run over by a truck and then left to think about what it had done. It has exactly 2 leaves, which grow from a squat woody stem and sprawl across the desert floor in long, tattered, twisted ribbons. The leaves split and fray over time from wind and sun, so older specimens look like a tangled heap of shredded leather on the sand. They are extraordinary. The oldest known Welwitschia has been carbon dated to around 1500 years. The lineage it belongs to dates back over 100 million years to the Jurassic period. In a drought, antelope and rhinos chew the leaves for moisture and spit out the fibres. Its Afrikaans name, Twyfelfontein, means 2 leaves that cannot die. The Jurassic period, 100 million years. Still here, still making it work. Namibia, in a plant. Chapter 2. The First People and the Long Wait for Everyone Else. Here is the timeline problem with Namibian history. If you're trying to tell the story of the first people who lived here, you have to go back so far that all your usual historical reference points become useless. We're not talking Roman Empire far, we're not talking ancient Egypt far. We're talking about a lineage of human beings who were living in southern Africa before agriculture was invented, before the wheel, before writing, before the concept of a city existed anywhere on Earth. The San people, the Bushmen, the first inhabitants of this land, have genetic signatures that some researchers believe diverge from the rest of modern humanity around 80,000 to 100,000 years ago. The San aren't just old. The San are the beginning. Let's put that number in perspective. The pyramids at Giza were built about 4,500 years ago. The San were already in this landscape for something like 95,000 years before that. Whatever memory a San elder carried in their head about the history of their people, they were holding a thread that stretched back further than almost anything else you can find in the human story. And they held it not in writing — the San had no writing system — but in story, in song, in ritual, and in rock art that you can still go and look at today if you know where to find it. The rock art is important, so let's stop there, because this is one of the things I find genuinely astonishing about Namibia. The oldest known San rock paintings in the country have been dated to around 26,000 years old. Not the paintings at Twyfelfontein, those are relatively recent by comparison. I'm talking about red ochre figures on rock faces that were made by people who were alive during the last ice age, when the sea levels were different, when woolly mammoths still existed in the northern hemisphere, when Europe was covered in glaciers, and somewhere in what is now Namibia, a person picked up pigment and pressed an image into stone that we can still see. If that doesn't make you feel something, I don't know what to tell you. Twyfelfontein is the site most people have heard of, and it's worth explaining why. It's a valley in the Damaraland region of northwest Namibia, centered around a spring, a reliable source of water in an otherwise bone-dry landscape. And because water meant life, people kept coming back to it. The oldest engravings at Twyfelfontein date to around 6,000 years ago, though some estimates push older. Over at least 2,000 years, San hunter-gatherers carved more than 2,500 images into the sandstone surfaces of this valley. Giraffes without hooves, their legs tapering into thin lines representing, scholars believe, the sensation of rising up during a trance state. A lion with 5 toes on each paw, one more than a real lion has, indicating a shaman who has taken on lion form. A pregnant female kudu, used as a symbol of fertility and female initiation. These are not decorative pictures. This is a theological library, encoded in stone. There's also an engraving of a seal at Twyfelfontein. The ocean is roughly 100 kilometers away. Someone walked to the coast, saw a seal, remembered it, came back to the valley, and carved it into rock. Or they heard about seals from someone else who had made the journey, and the image travelled through layers of oral transmission until it was deemed important enough to put into stone. And there are flamingos carved there too, flamingos that gather in spectacular pink masses around the salt pans of the coast, hundreds of kilometres from the valley. Either way, the world was already connected in ways we sometimes forget about when we think of prehistoric people as isolated and static. These were not static people. The San were navigating a continent. Twyfelfontein was a place you came back to, season after season, generation after generation. The spring kept things alive, the engravings kept things remembered, and when the San who made the last ones finally moved on or disappeared, the stone held the record anyway. For tens of thousands of years, the San were the only people in this landscape. Their life was built around intimate knowledge of their environment, the kind of knowledge that doesn't fit in a book because it can't be abstracted from the place itself. They knew the seasonal patterns of every animal in their territory. They could identify hundreds of plant species and knew which were edible, which were medicinal, and which would kill you. Their tracking abilities were and are, because San trackers still practice and still teach today, considered among the most sophisticated in the world. A San hunter could look at a print in the sand and tell you not just what animal made it, but how long ago, how fast it was moving, whether it was injured, and which direction it was heading. They could read the way moisture clung to disturbed soil at the edge of a track and calculate to within a reasonable window when the animal passed. They followed hunts that lasted multiple days, sustaining the chase through intimate knowledge of terrain, animal psychology, and endurance built from a lifetime of nothing but walking. This was not mysticism. This was science, accumulated and refined over an almost unimaginable length of time, with no laboratory, no textbook, and no margin for error because the margin for error was starvation. Then, roughly 2,000 years ago, the party started getting more crowded. The first new arrivals were the Koko, specifically the Nama people, sometimes called Namakwa, who moved into the south and west of what is now Namibia, settling around the Orange River and the surrounding areas. The Koko were not hunter-gatherers, they were pastoralists. They kept sheep and goats and organized their societies around herding. This was a genuinely significant distinction because it meant different ideas about land, territory, and resources. Hunter-gatherers think of land as something you move through and share. Pastoralists think of land as something that belongs to whoever's herd is on it right now, plus some buffer around it. These are not compatible philosophies. They never have been, anywhere in human history. And so the San, who had been the only humans in this landscape for thousands of years, began to be pushed further east into the more inhospitable desert terrain, where the pastoralists' animals couldn't easily follow. The Koko and the San share a linguistic family. Both speak languages built around the remarkable system of click consonants that linguists have studied intensively and that everyone who hears them for the first time finds completely impossible to reproduce correctly. There are multiple distinct click sounds in Khoisan languages, each made in a different part of the mouth, and they function as consonants just like any other. If you've never heard someone speak a click language at pace, it sounds like someone is simultaneously talking and tapping out a complex rhythm. It is one of the most distinctive sounds in human language, and it is ancient beyond any other surviving linguistic feature we know of. Then came the Damara, and the Damara are a puzzle that has been giving historians and anthropologists headaches for decades in the most entertaining possible way. Here's the problem. The Damara speak a Koko language essentially the same family as the Nama, but their genetic profile places them much closer to Bantu groups like the Herero and Himba, which means they almost certainly began as a Bantu-speaking people, adopted a completely different language, and then carried that adopted language into a new territory, while keeping a body of oral tradition that claims they were here before the Nama arrived. Their own accounts say they entered what is now Namibia from the equatorial rainforests to the north, before any of the other major groups. They were smelters of copper. They grew pumpkins and corn and tobacco. They traded with the Ovambo to the north and the Nama to the south. They were, to put it plainly, an extremely complicated people doing extremely well for themselves in a landscape that does not make complexity easy. And then, around the 14th century, the Bantu expansion reached Namibia in earnest. The Bantu expansion is one of the most consequential population movements in African history, a long, gradual wave of migration that carried Bantu-speaking agricultural peoples southward from Central Africa over the course of roughly 3,000 years. When it hit Namibia, it arrived in the form of the Ovambo and Kavango peoples, who settled in the north along what is now the Angolan border. The landscape there is different from the central and southern parts of the country. More rainfall, more reliable rivers, more ability to farm. So the Ovambo built their communities around flood recession agriculture, fishing and cattle, and they stayed mostly in the north. The Kalahari and the Desert Plateau were not particularly appealing to people whose whole economic system required reliable water, which is a very sensible position to take, and it meant that the northern and southern halves of what would become Namibia developed largely in parallel for a long time. The Ovambo didn't arrive as a unified people, they arrived as a collection of related groups who gradually organized themselves into distinct kingdoms. By the 17th century, these had crystallized into named polities: Ondonga, Okwanyama, Ukwambi, and others. 12 kingdoms in total, each with its own leadership, its own territory, its own internal political logic. This wasn't a loose confederation of wandering bands. The Ovambo kingdoms were structured societies with agricultural systems, trade networks, craft production. The Ovambo smithed iron and traded weapons and implements across long distances, and a political sophistication that would later make them extremely difficult to colonize. More on that. Also in the 17th century, the Herero arrived. The Herero came from the east, out of the Great Lakes region of Central Africa, and entered Namibia from the northwest. They were cattle people, fundamentally cattle people, in a way that went well beyond economics into identity and cosmology. Cattle were wealth, yes, but they were also spiritual currency, social currency, the measure of a man and a family and a lineage. The Herero moved into Caucaland first, the arid, dramatic northwest, and by the mid-19th century, some groups had drifted south into the central grasslands. They were semi-nomadic, moving their herds with the seasons, and they were confident, not aggressive by default, but not the kind of people who shrank from confrontation. They would need that quality. The 19th century was going to require it. Meanwhile, the San continued doing what the San had always done. In the spaces between these larger population movements living in the desert edges, the mountain fringes, the places no one else particularly wanted. Their role in the larger social landscape shifted and compressed over time. Some San groups entered into trading or service relationships with the incoming pastoralists. Others retreated further into the Kalahari. Their numbers, which had once been the entire human population of southern Africa, contracted slowly as group after group arrived with more animals, more weapons, and a very different philosophy about how land should be used. It was not a sudden catastrophe in this period. That would come later, and it would come from Europe. For now, it was the slow geological pressure of one world pushing against another, across a landscape vast enough that avoidance was still, just barely, an option. And so, by the time the first European ships appeared on the horizon in the late 15th century, Namibia was not an empty land. It was a layered, complex, linguistically extraordinary social landscape. Hunter-gatherers with 100,000-year head start, pastoralists from the south who had reshaped the politics of the desert fringe, a copper-smelting enigma, people with a disputed origin story and a language that belonged to someone else, farming kingdoms in the north with 12 distinct polities and a metal trade that spanned hundreds of kilometers, cattle herders who had walked here from the lakes of Central Africa and were still sorting out where exactly they were going to set up permanently. All of these people on all of this land, with a depth of history and cultural richness that the Europeans sailing by would almost entirely fail to notice, classify correctly, or value in the slightest, which was a consistent pattern across the continent and one that was about to get very much worse. That closing image is worth sitting with for a moment, because Namibia in the 15th century was not the wild, empty, ahistorical space that European maps like to leave blank. It was a continent within a continent, 5 or 6 distinct civilizations in various stages of arrangement, each with a different relationship to the land and to each other, all of them navigating a terrain so extreme it had already shaped their languages, their economies, their spiritual lives, and their bodies. The fog beetles drinking the Atlantic, the Welwitschia reaching down 30 feet for water, the San reading the desert like a text. None of these things happened by accident, and none of them happened quickly. They happened over the longest timescale human beings can occupy, and the fact that they were all still there, still working, when the first Portuguese ship arrived, that is the story of the first chapter of Namibia's human history. Chapter 3. Before the flag arrived. Let's talk about the Portuguese for a moment, because they have a habit of showing up at the beginning of these African history episodes and then quietly leaving before anything interesting happens. In 1485, a navigator named Diogo Caun sailed south along the west coast of Africa on behalf of King João II of Portugal, reached the Namibian coastline, and planted a stone pillar at a place called Cape Cross. The pillar was called a padrão, a marker of Portuguese sovereignty, engraved with the royal arms. He put it in the sand and sailed back to Portugal. 2 years later, Bartolomeu Dias came through, stopped at what is now Walvis Bay, and kept going south to round the Cape of Good Hope. The Portuguese were enormously interested in finding a sea route to India. Namibia was, to them, an inconvenience on the way to somewhere more profitable. And so after planting their markers and sketching their maps, they largely left the Namibian coast to the fog and the seals, and the people already living here continued their business without European interruption for the better part of 2 centuries, which, frankly, was lucky for them. The real action in this period was not on the coast at all. It was inland, where the various peoples of Namibia were doing what all people do when they share a landscape with limited water and excellent grass for cattle. They were negotiating, competing, trading, fighting, and occasionally arriving at arrangements that kept the whole system more or less functional. Let's map the scene as it looked around the 17th and 18th centuries, because it's genuinely more complicated and more interesting than the colonial story tends to give it credit for. In the north, the Ovambo kingdoms had hit their stride. These were not loose tribal confederacies. By the 17th century, you had 12 distinct Ovambo polities: Ondonga, Okwanyama, Ukwambi, and others, each with its own ruling dynasty, its own territory, and its own political machinery. The Ovambo economy was sophisticated. They farmed the seasonal floodplains of the Kuvlai Basin using flood recession agriculture, which meant timing their planting around the predictable floods that came down from Angola each wet season. They fished the shallow waterways. They herded cattle, and they smelted and worked iron into tools and weapons which they traded across long distances. Ivory, iron goods, salt, and cattle moved along established Ovambo trade networks that connected to the Portuguese sphere in Angola to the north and to the Herero and Nama territories to the south. For a people in the second driest country on earth, this is an impressive commercial operation. The Ovambo also had the considerable advantage of geography. They were far enough north that the early trickle of European traders and missionaries who reached the edges of Namibia in the 1800s barely touched them. The Germans, when they eventually colonized Namibia in 1884, didn't even bother trying to administer Ovamboland. It was too far, too populous, too well organized, and the people were too clearly not interested in being administered. The Ovambo kingdoms remained functionally independent well into the 20th century, which is a remarkable achievement that tends to get underplayed in the standard colonial narrative. Most of the scramble for Africa was about carving up territories on maps. The Ovambo made clear repeatedly that the map was one thing and the reality was another. In the centre of the country, things were considerably more dynamic, meaning chaotic, depending on your perspective. The central plateau was Herero territory by the mid-18th century. The Herero had expanded south from Caucaland, following the grasslands that their cattle required, and had established a semi-nomadic presence across a huge swath of what is now central and north-central Namibia. Their social structure was distinctive. Wealth was measured in cattle. Marriages were sealed with cattle exchanges, and the sacred ancestral fire at the centre of each homestead was tended by the senior wife and could never, under any circumstances, be allowed to go out. This wasn't just a cultural practice, it was a theological statement. The fire was the link between the living and the ancestors. To let it die was to sever that connection, which was about as unthinkable as things get. The Herero also had a dual inheritance system property passed through both the father's and mother's lineages simultaneously, which meant every individual belonged to two clans at once, each with its own obligations and entitlements. It sounds like the kind of thing that would cause endless family arguments, and it probably did. But it also created an extraordinarily resilient social web, where kinship ties spread in multiple directions and no single catastrophe could easily unravel the whole structure. So the Herero carried their sacred fires with them across hundreds of kilometers of grassland, and their dual lineage system held their communities together across vast distances. As a piece of social engineering for a nomadic pastoral people, it was genuinely elegant. Then, from the south, arrived the Orlams. This is where things get genuinely complicated, and also a bit foreshadowing in terms of the disasters ahead. The Orlams were mixed descent communities from the Cape Colony people of Khoikhoi ancestry, who had absorbed Boer customs, spoken Afrikaans for generations, and, most critically, had acquired firearms, horses, and wagons. They were not European colonizers, but they weren't the same as the traditional Nama either. They occupied a strange in-between space that the colonial world was increasingly creating across southern Africa. Moving north into Namibia from the late 18th century onwards, they were looking for land, grazing, and opportunity, and they found all three. The most significant Orlam leader was a man called Jonker Afrikaner, which is one of the great names in southern African history and sounds like it was invented by someone writing a very good historical novel. Jonker settled in the early 1840s at a place the Nama called Igams, meaning firewater or hot springs in their language, a reference to the natural springs that bubbled up from the rocks there. He renamed it after a farm in the Cape Colony where he had been born. He called it Windhoek. Yes, the capital of modern Namibia, a city of skyscrapers and German bakeries and a very nice international airport, was named after a farm in the Cape Colony by an Orlam warlord who missed home. One of history's more inadvertent acts of urban planning. Jonker controlled the trade routes through the Central Plateau, extracted cattle tribute from weaker neighbours, operated something that might be generously described as a protection racket across a vast stretch of semi-arid savanna, and entered into an arrangement with the Nama chief Oaseb to act as a kind of armed intermediary between the Nama to the south and the Herero to the north, which worked brilliantly for Jonker and somewhat less brilliantly for everyone else. The central decades of the 19th century were not a peaceful time in what would become Namibia. From the 1830s onwards, the region was engulfed in waves of conflict. Herero pushing south looking for new pasture, Nama and Orlams pushing north and east looking for the same, everyone competing over the same limited resource of good grazing land in a country that is mostly not good grazing land. Guns arrived through European traders and missionaries and made everything worse, as guns tend to do when they appear in a context of existing competition. The Herero suffered badly under Jonker Afrikaner's raids at one point. A European Christian missionary reported, with what seems like premature certainty, that the Herero as a people had ceased to exist. The Herero had very much not ceased to exist. They were in serious trouble, but they were not finished. The peace, such as it was, came in 1858 after Jonker Afrikaner's death and a series of negotiations brokered in part by the Rhenish missionaries who had arrived looking for souls to save and ended up becoming, with varying degrees of reluctance, diplomatic actors. It is one of the recurring ironies of missionary history in Africa that the people sent to transform indigenous societies often got transformed by them, instead learning languages, forming genuine attachments, and frequently finding themselves caught between the colonial interests of their home countries and the people they had come to serve. By the mid-1860s, under the great chief Herero, the Herero had consolidated their power, recovered much of what they had lost, and established themselves as the dominant political force across central Namibia. Herero was a formidable figure, a unifier who brought together several competing Herero chieftaincies, negotiated skillfully with the missionaries and traders now present in growing numbers, and built the kind of centralized authority that his people hadn't possessed before. Under his leadership, the Herero controlled enormous herds of cattle and vast stretches of the central plateau. They were powerful, organized, and by any reasonable measure doing well, which in the history of this particular region of the world in this particular century meant that something was coming. Meanwhile, Walvis Bay, the one genuinely excellent natural harbour on the Namibian coast, a deep water port sheltered from the Atlantic swell by a long sand spit, had attracted enough interest from the British that they quietly annexed it in 1878. Not because they particularly wanted Namibia, but because they emphatically did not want anyone else to have the harbour. Norwegian whalers had been working the Skeleton Coast for decades, processing whale carcasses on the beaches and doing brisk business in whale oil. British traders had established tentative connections inland. German missionaries from the Rhenish Missionary Society had been flowing into the interior since the 1840s, learning local languages, building churches, and critically writing meticulous letters back to Germany describing the territory, its people, its resources, and its political situation. The German government was reading those letters. The coast was no longer as empty as it appeared, and the major European powers were starting to pay very close attention to what remained on the African continent that hadn't yet been formally claimed. This was the beginning of what historians call the scramble for Africa, that extraordinary and destructive period in the 1870s and 80s, when the European powers essentially sat down, looked at a map of the continent, and decided to divide it among themselves at speed, with minimal concern for what the people already living there might prefer. The Berlin Conference of 1884, convened by the German Chancellor Otto von Bismarck, formalized this process. 14 European nations attended. Not a single African kingdom was invited. The conference set the rules by which European nations could claim African territory. You needed to be able to demonstrate what they called effective occupation of a region to have your claim recognized internationally, which is a fantastic rule if you're a European power with a navy, and a genuinely catastrophic one if you're an African kingdom that has been effectively occupying your land for centuries and didn't realize you needed to file the right paperwork in Berlin. Germany, as a newly unified nation still building its imperial credentials, was hungry for colonies. Chancellor Bismarck had actually been skeptical of African colonialism for years. He was worried about overextension and didn't think the economics made sense. But by 1884, domestic political pressure and the fear of being left behind by Britain and France had shifted his thinking. A German merchant named Adolf Luderitz had already negotiated a highly dubious land deal at the Bay of Angra Pequena on the Namibian south coast, buying a strip of coastal territory from a local Nama chief. With the dimensions specified in miles in the contract but which Luderitz and his lawyers quickly reinterpreted as geographical miles, which are roughly 7 times larger. The Nama chief, who had no reason to know the difference between a standard mile and a geographical mile, signed something he thought was a small coastal strip and discovered he had apparently sold a region roughly the size of Luxembourg. It was a preview of the methods to come. On the 24th of April, 1884, Bismarck declared the territory of German Southwest Africa a German protectorate. Namibia had a new government, whether it wanted one or not. The Ovambo kingdoms in the far north largely shrugged the Germans were not yet their problem. The Herero in the centre continued their cattle ranching. not yet fully understanding what protectorate would come to mean in practice. The Nama in the south were understandably nervous, having dealt with the Germans' representative in Lüderitz and seen exactly how his negotiating style worked. And the missionaries, who had spent decades building relationships, learning languages, and genuinely engaging with the people of this landscape, watched the colonial administration arrive with what many of them recorded as a mixture of hope and deep unease. They had not, it would turn out, been wrong to feel uneasy. The 20th century was coming, and it was bringing something that would take Namibia over 100 years to begin to recover from. Chapter 4. The Flag and What It Brought. Germany's colonial administration of Southwest Africa began in a way that was almost comically chaotic, and then became something much darker. The first German soldiers didn't actually arrive until 1889, 5 years after the Protectorate was declared, which tells you roughly how organised the whole enterprise was at the start. There were perhaps 3,000 German settlers in the entire territory by 1903. The territory itself was more than twice the size of Germany. The economics were not, initially, encouraging. Unlike Germany's other African colonies, Southwest Africa offered limited promise for agricultural extraction or large-scale mining. What it became, instead, was Germany's only genuine settler colony, a place where German families came to farm, to ranch, and to make a life, which put them in direct and immediate competition with the people who were already doing exactly that. The governor who managed the first decade of substantive German rule was a pragmatist named Theodor Leutwein, and his approach was, relatively speaking, sophisticated, which in this context means he was minimally violent by the standards of what came later, which is an extremely low bar. Leutwein's method was divide and rule. He made protection treaties between rival indigenous groups, then used one side to defeat the other when a treaty was violated, seizing their land and cattle and selling it to settlers at a profit. He built roads and railways to open the interior. He expanded German control southward without committing the massive military expenditure that full-scale warfare would have required. He even occasionally acknowledged in his private letters that the indigenous peoples of the territory had legitimate grievances. He seems to have understood, intellectually, what was happening. He did it anyway, because the alternative, which was to leave people in possession of their land and their cattle and their sovereignty, was not an option that the colonial mandate entertained. He was, by the lights of the colonial world he inhabited, a rational administrator. By any other lights, he was dismantling the economic and political foundations of every indigenous community he touched, one treaty at a time. The cattle were the crux of everything. The Herero measured their wealth, their status, their social relationships, and their spiritual life in cattle. When the German settlers arrived and began accumulating land, the Herero found themselves in escalating debt buying goods on credit from German traders, losing cattle to cover those debts, losing more land as collateral, buying more goods on credit, losing more cattle. It was a spiral that looked, from the outside, like commerce, and functioned from the inside like slow strangulation. The debt itself was partly a product of the monetary economy. The Germans had introduced an economy the Herero were being forced to participate in without having designed or agreed to its rules, and in which the legal system was controlled by the people to whom they owed money. This is not a novel colonial technique. It worked everywhere it was tried. And then, in 1897, the Rinderpest arrived. Rinderpest is a catastrophic viral disease of cattle, and the strain that swept across sub-Saharan Africa in the late 19th century was as close to total as these things get. In Namibia, it was catastrophic, killing up to 90% of the Herero herds in some estimates, devastating the Nama equally, and wiping out massive numbers of wild buffalo and antelope across the region. The following year brought drought and famine. In a single epidemic season, the economic basis of an entire pastoral civilization was wiped out. The Herero were suddenly destitute, dependent on German traders for food, and unable to service debts they had accumulated against cattle that were now dead. The German settlers, who had diversified interests and access to colonial credit from Germany, were comparatively fine. The gap that opened between them in 1897 never closed. The Germans bought the land of the Herero who couldn't pay their debts. More settlers arrived, more land was taken, and the Herero watched the horizon of possibility contracting year by year. By 1903, the Herero had heard that they were to be confined to reservations, formal parcels of land, beyond which they would have no legal right to graze their remaining cattle. This was not a rumour, it was policy, and it meant the end of the semi-nomadic cattle culture that had defined Herero life for generations. You can decide for yourself at what point a population concludes that the remaining option is armed resistance. For the Herero, that point came on the 12th of January, 1904, when Chief Samuel Maharero, son of the great Maharero, who had built the Herero's 19th century power, ordered his people to rise. They killed approximately 123 German settlers in the opening days, carefully, deliberately sparing women, children, missionaries, and non-combatant men. The Herero were making a point, not a massacre. The German response would not make the same distinction. Berlin sent reinforcements, 14,000 of them, eventually, plus heavy artillery and machine guns. In June 1904, a general named Lothar von Trotha arrived. He was a veteran of colonial wars in German East Africa and of the Boxer Rebellion in China, where he had distinguished himself by being particularly brutal. He had not been sent to Southwest Africa to negotiate. His expressed philosophy of colonial warfare, which he later stated clearly for the record, was, "I use force with terrorism and even brutality." He arrived, assessed the situation, and devised a plan. In August 1904, he drove the Herero forces to the Waterberg Plateau, a highland area with good grazing land and water, where the Herero had concentrated approximately 60,000 people, of whom perhaps 5,000 carried weapons. Von Trotha encircled them on 3 sides. The 4th side opened east, into the Orange Desert, a western arm of the Kalahari, waterless and merciless. He was not trying to capture the Herero, he was trying to funnel them. The battle at Waterberg on the 11th of August lasted a single day. The artillery did its work. The Herero broke through the eastern gap and fled into the Omaheke with their women, their children, their old people, and whatever cattle hadn't already been lost. Von Trotha ordered his troops to seal the desert behind them. He poisoned the waterholes along a 240-kilometre cordon. He stationed guards with orders to shoot on sight any Herero, armed or unarmed, who attempted to return. Then, on the 2nd of October, 1904, he issued the document now known as the Vernichtungsbefehl, the extermination order. Within the German borders, it read, "Every Herero, whether found armed or unarmed, with or without cattle, will be shot. I shall not accept any more women and children." He had it translated into Ochihero and distributed as a proclamation. He wanted the Herero to know. German soldiers found the dying in the desert men, women, children, elderly in lines stretching for kilometres, following the dry riverbeds east toward water that wasn't there. The waterholes had been poisoned, the cordon guards had orders to shoot, the desert did the rest. One German soldier wrote in a letter home that the death rattle of the dying and the shrieks of the mad echoed in what he called the sublime stillness of infinity. He He described it as terrible. He was part of the force that had made it happen. He received no punishment and no censure. The extermination order stood for 2 months before the Kaiser, under sustained pressure from Chancellor von Bülow and the German general staff, who were not motivated by mercy but by the calculation that Liv Herero were useful, as Labour finally rescinded it in December. By then, roughly 50,000 Herero had died. The surviving 15,000 or so, down from perhaps 80,000 before the war, were herded into concentration camps. On a fog-soaked island near the port of Lüderitz called Shark Island, an island that the cold Benguela current kept bitterly cold. Almost year-round prisoners were put to work building the harbour and the railway. They were fed barely enough to remain functional, stripped of warm clothing in defiance of the Atlantic wind, and worked until they could not work anymore. The mortality rate exceeded 70%. Shark Island stayed open until 1907. The Nama watched what happened to the Herero and understood exactly what it meant. Their most formidable leader was an elderly man named Hendrik Witbooi, who had for years maintained a pragmatic working arrangement with the Germans. In late 1904, he called a council of elders, heard the reports from those who had witnessed the Herero's fate, and declared war. He was in his 70s. He fought as a guerrilla commander across the southern desert for a year before dying in battle in October 1905. The Nama resistance continued under other leaders until 1908, when the last fighters were finally captured. About half of the Nama population died. Many of the survivors were transported to concentration camps in Germany's other colonies, Togo and Cameroon, to serve as forced labour far from their homeland. The German official history of the war against the Herero recorded, with what seems to have been genuine satisfaction, that the Herero ceased to exist as a tribe. They had not. But the intent had been expressed, and was on paper. Historians now broadly recognise these events as the first genocide of the 20th century, predating the Armenian genocide by a decade, predating the Holocaust by 40 years. In 2015, the German government formally acknowledged the events as genocide. In 2021, after years of negotiation largely conducted without meaningful consultation with the survivors' descendants, Germany agreed to pay €1.1 billion over 30 years in development aid to Namibia. Note, not reparations, development aid. The descendants of the Herero and Nama, organised under the slogan, "Nothing about us without us," have made their feelings about this distinction quite clear. Germany's time in Namibia ended not from any internal reckoning, but because of a world war. In 1915, South African troops invaded and occupied German southwest Africa without particular difficulty. The Germans surrendered. The Treaty of Versailles gave South Africa a League of Nations mandate to administer the territory, which was, in theory, a trusteeship arrangement, a temporary stewardship on behalf of a future independent state. In practice, it was annexation with nicer paperwork. South Africa treated Southwest Africa as a fifth province, settled white Afrikaner farmers on the land, and had no intention whatsoever of ever leaving. In 1946, South Africa formally asked the United Nations, the League of Nations successor, for permission to simply annex the territory outright. The UN said no. South Africa shrugged and kept running it as if the answer had been yes. When the National Party came to power in 1948 and formalised apartheid as a comprehensive racial legal system, they extended that system to Southwest Africa as well. The Bantustans, the pass books, the prohibition of mixed marriages, the separate facilities, the forced removals, the arbitrary detention, the systematic violence, all of it arrived in a territory that had already endured 30 years of German colonial genocide and hadn't had a moment to breathe in between. Namibia's people had now been colonized twice by two different countries under two different systems of racial law, with no break in between. This is not something that heals quickly. The United Nations told South Africa to leave, repeatedly and formally, starting in 1946. South Africa said no. The International Court of Justice ruled South Africa's continued presence in Namibia illegal in 1971. South Africa kept ruling. The UN renamed the territory Namibia in 1968, recognized SWAPO, the Southwest Africa People's Organization, founded in 1960 as the only legitimate representative of the Namibian people, and authorized an armed liberation struggle. South Africa kept ruling, kept arresting, kept disappearing people, and kept bombing SWAPO camps across the Angolan border. The war that followed was long, brutal, and deeply entangled with the Cold War. Cuban troops supported Angola and SWAPO. South African and American interests aligned against them, and a generation of Namibian and Angolan young people fought and died in a bush war that the superpowers monitored from a comfortable distance. A few thousand South African soldiers died. Estimates of Namibian and Angolan casualties run into the tens of thousands. All of this continued, grinding and relentless, and largely invisible to the outside world, until the late 1980s, when South Africa's military campaign in Angola finally collapsed under its own weight. The Cold War began to thaw, and the architecture of 100 years of colonial occupation began, very slowly but very unmistakably, to crack. What the colonial period left behind was not just trauma and dispossession, though it left plenty of both, but a specific material legacy that shaped everything that came after. The land distribution that the Germans and then the South Africans had engineered was still intact when the liberation struggle finally ended. 80% of the productive agricultural land in Namibia was still in the hands of roughly 4,000 white commercial farmers. The Herero, whose ancestors had controlled that land for generations, had been reduced to a fraction of their pre-genocide population and confined to arid, economically marginal areas. The contracts of labour that had replaced slavery in name while replicating it in practice were still structuring the economy, and the legal and administrative institutions that the South African apartheid state had built, passbooks, Bantustans, population registers organised by race, had to be dismantled piece by piece by a new government that inherited them, along with a country that had never, in the whole of its modern existence, been allowed to govern itself. Chapter 5. Free at last, now what? The 21st of March, 1990, Windhoek, a stadium packed with people who have been waiting for this for their entire lives, and in many cases their parents' entire lives, and in some cases their grandparents' entire lives. The United Nations Secretary-General, Javier Pérez de Cuellar, swears in Samuel Shafishuna Nujoma as the first president of the Republic of Namibia. Watching from the crowd, Nelson Mandela, released from prison barely 5 weeks earlier, representatives from 147 countries, 20 heads of state, F.W., de Klerk, the South African president, present at the formal transfer of a territory his government had illegally occupied for 75 years. It was, by any measure, an extraordinary moment. One of the last dominoes of African colonial rule falling. The country that had been a German protectorate, then a League of Nations mandate, then a de facto South African province, then a battleground in a Cold War proxy conflict. Finally, at the age of nearly a century as a named political entity, got to decide for itself what it wanted to be. Sam Nujoma himself had been in exile for nearly 30 years. He left Namibia in 1960 as a young man, co-founded SWAPO in Tanzania, built it from a petition organization into a liberation army, travelled from capital to capital for decades, making the case for Namibian independence at a time when many Western governments considered South Africa a valued Cold War ally and Namibian liberation an inconvenience. He did this with very little money, very little international support in the early years, and the knowledge that the people he was representing were living under an apartheid system that could arbitrarily arrest, torture, or disappear them. He came home in September 1989, one day before the UN deadline for voter registration, to lead his party to victory in the elections that would produce the Constituent Assembly that would write the constitution that would make the country real. 98% of registered voters turned out, almost all of them. The UN certified it free and fair. When Nujoma walked off the plane, there were people in the crowd who had never in their adult lives lived in a free country. Their parents had not lived in a free country. Their grandparents had not lived in a free country. That particular accumulation of weight is hard to describe from the outside, and probably needs to be felt from the inside to be fully understood. The constitution that Namibia produced in 1990 was and remains one of the most admired in Africa. It was adopted unanimously by the Constituent Assembly. It established a multi-party democracy, an independent judiciary, a Bill of Rights, press freedom, and a 2-term presidential limit. That last part is worth noting, because term limits are one of those things that sound obvious until a popular leader who's won 3 elections in a row decides that the rules don't apply to them. Nujoma actually pushed for and got a constitutional amendment allowing himself a 3rd term, which was not a great look and was widely criticised. But he also, more importantly, actually stepped down when that 3rd term ended in 2005, an act of political self-restraint that is unfortunately rarer than it should be on this continent, or any other. The policy that defined Namibia's political transition, more than any other single decision, was national reconciliation. Nujoma announced it almost immediately. There would be no witch hunts, no trials of apartheid-era officials, no retribution against those who had enforced white minority rule. Former enemies from both sides of the Liberation War were granted amnesty. White farmers and former colonial administrators were, explicitly, invited to stay and participate in building the new country. Those who chose to leave were free to go. Those who chose to stay were protected by a constitution that treated them as full citizens. It was a deliberate echo of what Nelson Mandela was simultaneously building across the border in South Africa, and it was motivated by the same pragmatic calculation. A country torn apart by recrimination would not survive its first decade. The Constitution protected private property rights, which meant the land question the most urgent and explosive unresolved issue in the country. The thing that the liberation struggle had fundamentally been about would have to be addressed through the market, not through expropriation. This was a choice, and like all choices, it had costs. It bought political stability at the price of slower justice. It protected white minority economic power in exchange for their cooperation. It told the families of genocide victims and apartheid survivors that the government's first priority was not their restitution, but everyone's coexistence. Whether that was the right call is a question Namibians are still actively and sometimes heatedly debating, more than 3 decades on. And then there was the land. About 6,000 white commercial farm owners held roughly 36 million hectares of productive agricultural land. Almost all the good farming country in the central and southern plateau. 120,000 black farming families shared the rest. The government established a willing seller, willing buyer policy. The state would buy land from white farmers who chose to sell it and redistribute it to landless families. It was, in theory, market-based and fair. In practice, it was extraordinarily slow. Sellers had no great incentive to sell. The land was expensive. The government budget for resettlement was limited. And the families who had been dispossessed, some of them descendants of the very Herero and Nama who had survived the genocide a century earlier, were waiting for land that decades of policy had not delivered in anything like the quantities needed. The first National Land Conference was in 1991. The second wasn't until 2018. Progress, but not at the pace history demanded. On the economic front, the picture was complicated in a different way. Namibia was, on paper, a relatively wealthy country. It had diamonds, extraordinary, high-quality alluvial diamonds both onshore and increasingly from sophisticated marine mining operations off the Atlantic coast, using specialized vessels that crawl the seabed of the Benguela Shelf, sucking up diamond-bearing gravel. It had uranium. The Rosing mine, already operating since 1976 under South African administration, made Namibia one of the world's major uranium producers before independence, and new mines at Husab and Langer Heinrich in subsequent decades made it the third largest uranium producer on Earth. It had fish in extraordinary abundance because the cold Benguela current kept the offshore waters nutrient-rich and biologically productive in ways that attract enormous commercial fishing fleets. It had cattle and caracal sheep for export. It had one of the most spectacular tourism landscapes on the continent. The dunes, the skeleton coast, Etosha, Damaraland, which drew visitors willing to pay serious money to stand in that emptiness. In 1994, South Africa also handed back Walvis Bay, the deep-water harbour that had been excised from the territory, completing the physical geography of the new country. By the raw numbers, GDP nearly tripled between 1990 and 2019, and per capita income placed Namibia in the upper middle income bracket by World Bank standards. These are not small achievements for a country that started from zero. But here's where the numbers become a cruel joke. Namibia has, depending on which year you look at, either the highest or second highest Gini coefficient in the world, a measure of income inequality in which a score of 1 means one person holds everything, and a score of 0 means perfect equality. Namibia's score hovers around 0.6 to 1. Only South Africa scores higher. Think about that for a moment. A country that fought a liberation war specifically about economic dispossession, that produced one of the most progressive constitutions on the continent, that has held democratic elections for 3 decades and never had a military coup, is statistically almost the most unequal country on Earth. Unemployment sits at around 37% by ILO measures. Youth unemployment is higher. The diamond wealth flows mostly offshore or accumulates in a narrow Windhoek elite. The uranium mines employ a tiny share of the population and require highly specialized skills that most Namibians don't have access to. The fishing quotas, historically, have often been allocated to politically connected interests rather than the coastal communities whose ancestors fished those same waters. And the land that the genocide was fought over, the land that the apartheid system was organized around, is still not redistributed in any meaningful quantity 3.5 decades after independence. This is not a simple problem, and it does not have a simple solution, but it is the defining unfinished business of Namibian freedom. SWAPO has won every election since independence, often by enormous margins. At their peak, they took 80% of the National Assembly vote, which is the kind of number that sounds more like a referendum than an election. This is not, or not only, because they cheat. International observers have broadly certified Namibian elections as free and fair, and most independent analysis concludes that SWAPO's majorities are genuine expressions of popular support. It is because SWAPO is, and remains, the liberation movement that delivered independence, and in a country where the memory of what came before independence is living and present in people's grandparents' stories and in the composition of who owns the land, that credential is enormously powerful. The problem with ruling for 35 years on the strength of that credential is that it becomes increasingly difficult to separate the party from the state, which makes accountability harder, which allows problems to fester, which eventually erodes the very legitimacy that made you indispensable. By the 2024 elections, SWAPO's vote share had fallen to 53%, still a majority, still a win, but the worst result since independence. An opposition party called the Independent Patriots for Change took 20% of the vote. Something is unmistakably shifting, even if slowly. Those 2024 elections also produced something else. Namibia's first female president, Netumbo Nandi-Ndaitwah, a veteran SWAPO politician who had served as Foreign Affairs Minister, Deputy Prime Minister, and Vice President under 3 different presidents. He was elected in November 2024 with 58% of the vote. She became the first woman to lead the country, and one of only a handful of female heads of state in Africa's modern history. Namibia's constitution had for years included a zebra system, alternating male and female candidates on party lists to ensure gender representation in parliament, a mechanism that made Namibia one of the better represented countries for women in government globally. Nandi-Ndaitwah's election took that commitment to its logical end. In a country whose colonial history was built on the systematic dehumanization and dispossession of its people, and whose post-colonial politics had been shaped overwhelmingly by men who came out of a liberation movement where the fighters were largely male, the election of a female president is not a symbolic gesture. It is a statement about what Namibia has decided it is, and it is a statement worth making. Sam Nujoma himself, the founding father, the man who came home after 30 years in exile and gave a country its first morning of freedom, died in February 2025 at the age of 95. He was the last of his generation of African liberation leaders, the final living member of that extraordinary cohort that included Mandela, Nkrumah, Nyerere, Machel, and the others who presided over the end of the colonial era on this continent. He had outlived most of his contemporaries by decades, and he had watched from Windhoek as the country he built went through all the normal messy stages of becoming a real society. His death was mourned across Africa and across the world, and genuinely so, not the performed mourning of state funerals, but the real kind, from people who understood what he had done and why it mattered. Whatever his political shortcomings, the third-term gambit, the occasional authoritarian instinct, the period in government when he was perhaps a little too comfortable with power and a little too suspicious of dissent, he had earned his place in history in a way that very few people do. He had watched his country suffer. He had chosen to fight. He had waited 3 decades through an exile that would have broken most people. And he had come home. The country he left behind is not the country he dreamed of in exile. No country ever is, but it is a real country, with real institutions, a real democracy, a free press, independent courts that occasionally rule against the government, and a population that is very much alive to the question of what comes next. The violence is over. The occupation is over. The question now is the quieter, harder one. How do you build a just society on the foundations that colonialism left? How do you redistribute wealth without destroying the economy? How do you honour the dead without letting the dead define everything? These are not rhetorical questions. Namibia is working through them, generation by generation, election by election, policy by policy, argument by argument. It is a messy, difficult, hopeful process. It is, in other words, exactly what freedom looks like in practice. Chapter 6. What the Desert Kept. Let me tell you about Kolmanskop. It's a ghost town about 10 kilometers inland from the port of Luderitz in the southern Namib, and it might be the most visually bizarre place on earth. In 1908, a railway worker named Zacharias Luala was shoveling sand off the tracks when he noticed some stones glinting in the light. He took them to his supervisor, a German railway inspector named August Stauck, who immediately applied for a prospecting license. The stones were diamonds. Within 2 years, Kolmanskop was one of the wealthiest towns in the world. It had electricity, a tram line, a casino, a theatre, a bowling alley, a hospital with the first X-ray machine in the southern hemisphere, and an ice factory in the middle of the Namib Desert. They were making ice. Viennese sausages were imported. Opera was performed. About 1,000 people lived here in conditions of extraordinary colonial comfort, surrounded by one of the most hostile landscapes on the planet. By the 1930s, the surface diamonds were depleted. Richer deposits were found further south near the Orange River. The miners left in stages. The last residents abandoned the town completely in 1956, and the desert, which had been politely waiting the whole time, moved back in. Today the dunes flow through the doorways. They have filled the ballrooms waist high. They have swallowed bed frames and raised bathtubs, so they appear to float in sand like strange porcelain vessels. In some rooms, the original wallpaper, bright blue, floral, incongruously cheerful, is still visible above the drifts. Striped light comes through broken windows and illuminates the sand inside the casino, the hospital, the nursing quarters, in compositions that look less like ruined photography and more like someone commissioned a large-scale surrealist installation and then forgot about it for 60 years. The Tame Impala album cover was shot here. Parts of the Fallout TV series were filmed here. It is, objectively, one of the most photogenic places on Earth, which is a description it shares with many places in Namibia. Kolmanskop is what happens when a desert gets the last word, as it always does, eventually in Namibia. And in the context of this country's story, it is also a metaphor for the colonial project and for what the land quietly does to the things people impose upon it when those things are no longer strong enough to maintain their position. The desert's patience is one of the recurring themes of modern Namibia, because while the political story of the last 3 decades is about building, about assembling the institutions and the economy and the social fabric of a new country, the physical story of Namibia is about persistence, both the lands and its peoples. And right now, in the 2020s, those two stories are converging in ways that have enormous implications for everything the country is trying to do. Start with the oil. In February 2022, a company called Total Energies drilled a well called Venus, 1X, in the deep waters of the Orange Basin, about 290 kilometers off the Namibian coast, in 3,000 meters of water. They found oil. A lot of it estimates range widely, but the Venus field alone is thought to contain somewhere between 750 million and 5 billion recoverable barrels of light, sweet crude. Then came the Graf discovery from Shell. Then the Mopane field from Galp Energia, which may hold 10 billion barrels. By 2025, Namibia had experienced one of the most remarkable offshore exploration streaks in recent history. Something like 14 discoveries in 3 years, including 2 that qualify as giant-scale fields. Total potential across the Orange Basin, some estimates go as high as 20 billion barrels, though the more credible figures are significantly lower. The point is, a country that has never produced a drop of commercial oil may be about to become a major petroleum producer, with first oil potentially arriving as early as 2029. This is either a tremendous opportunity or a resource curse waiting to happen, depending on your perspective and your knowledge of how oil wealth tends to work in practice. The cautionary tales are numerous and instructive. Nigeria had more oil than it knew what to do with, and has spent 50 years watching the wealth evaporate into corruption, environmental disaster, and inequality, while the people of the Niger Delta live in conditions worse than they did before the drilling started. Angola's oil funded a decades-long civil war, and then went on to concentrate extraordinary wealth in the hands of the family of a man who ruled the country for 38 years. Equatorial Guinea's oil made its ruling family billionaires and left the majority of the population in poverty. The pattern is depressingly consistent across the continent and beyond. Oil rewards the state apparatus that controls it, and trickling those benefits down to ordinary people requires deliberate policy choices that are easy to talk about before the money arrives and much harder to implement once it does. Namibia is aware of this history. It scores relatively well on governance indices, it has functioning institutions, and its petroleum commissioner has given interviews specifically about the importance of avoiding the resource curse. But awareness is not inoculation. The country that has SWAPO winning elections on the strength of liberation credentials now faces the question of whether a sudden influx of oil revenues will tempt a long-incumbent party toward the kind of entrenchment that oil money historically enables, or whether Namibia's institutions are strong enough to channel that wealth toward the land reform and economic diversification that the country actually needs. Meanwhile, the conservancy model is working, and working well enough to be cited around the world as one of the most successful examples of community-based conservation anywhere on the planet. In the late 1980s, before independence, wildlife in Namibia's communal areas had been decimated by poaching, by uncontrolled hunting during the Liberation War, and by the fundamental logic of apartheid land policy, which separated communities entirely from any benefit they might derive from the wildlife around them. If an elephant eats your crops, and the meat and tourism money goes to a state that treats you as a non-citizen, why would you protect the elephant? Why not poach? The incentive structure was perfectly designed to destroy wildlife, and it worked. After independence, the government made a different bet. In 1993, with funding from the US Agency for International Development and WWF, a community-based natural resource management program was established. In 1996, formal legislation was passed, allowing communities to form communal conservancies, self-governed areas where local people had legal rights to wildlife management and the income from tourism and regulated hunting. The first 4 conservancies were registered in 1998. By 2025, there were 87, covering roughly 40 million acres, an area about the size of the state of Georgia, representing about 20% of the country's total land mass. Desert-adapted elephants have come back. Desert lions, a subspecies adapted to survive in one of the driest environments on Earth by drinking from fog and eating coastal seals, have come back. Black rhino populations have increased from the low hundreds toward a number that is no longer immediately terrifying. Tourism generates 14% of GDP. The conservancy model is what happens when you align economic incentives with conservation goals, and it is genuinely one of the things that Namibia got right. The conservancy system is not without its challenges. It is deeply vulnerable to the same thing that threatens everything in Namibia, the climate. An 11-year drought that stretched from the early 2010s into the mid-2020s, one of the longest and most severe on record, tested the model nearly to breaking point. Communities that had spent decades building their livelihoods around wildlife-based tourism found themselves watching their cattle die, their crops fail, and their tourism income collapse simultaneously. In 2024, President Nangolo Mbumba declared a national drought emergency and approved what officials described as a food relief hunt, a mass culling of game to provide protein to desperate communities. Conservancy members who had spent years protecting buffaloes and hippos and elephants were now being asked to shoot them. The irony is almost too bleak to look at directly. The same communities that had nurtured these animal populations back from near extinction over 30 years were now authorized to cull them because there wasn't enough water or grass for both animals and people. Climate change is not an abstract future threat in Namibia. It is an active, ongoing crisis in a country that already receives almost no rainfall, in a desert that climate modelling says will get significantly hotter and drier over the next 50 years, in a landscape that has essentially no buffer left to absorb additional environmental stress. For a country whose conservation model, whose tourism industry, and whose rural food security are all built on the assumption that there will be sufficient water and grass, this is an existential challenge, not a management problem. And then there's the question of identity, which is a different kind of challenge but no less important. Namibia has 14 major ethnic groups and somewhere around 26 languages, which is an extraordinary diversity for a country of 3 million people. It has a German-speaking minority, the descendants of colonial settlers who are deeply embedded in the farming and business economy and who have been here for 5 generations, speaking German at the kitchen table in houses built on land that was taken from someone else, and navigating a reconciliation narrative that asks them to stay and contribute, but does not always ask what they feel about any of it. It has the Himba of Kunene, a semi-nomadic pastoralist people in the northwest who have resisted outside interference with extraordinary consistency. They cover their skin with a blend of ochre and butterfat for protection against the sun and insects. They maintain complex pastoral traditions, and they have been pushing back against copper mining proposals, tourism developments, and dam projects on their ancestral land since before independence. It has the San, who were marginalized before colonialism, marginalized more aggressively during colonialism, and continue to be marginalized in the post-independence era, holding the deepest roots of anyone in this landscape, sitting on 80,000 years of accumulated knowledge about every plant and animal in the desert, and receiving some of the least benefit from the state that now governs the territory they occupied first. And it has the Herero, who have never stopped asking for the land that was taken from them, who gather every August in Okahanja in full traditional dress to commemorate their genocide dead, and who said, "Nothing about us without us," when Germany and Namibia cut their reparations deal without meaningfully consulting the people whose grandparents survived the Omaheke. What Namibia is doing right now, in the mid-2020s, is trying to hold all of these threads simultaneously. The oil boom and the conservancy model, the German tourists and the Herero commemorations, the national reconciliation and the still unaddressed land question, the democracy and the 35-year governing party, the second least densely populated country on Earth trying to build a modern state across 800,000 square kilometers of mostly desert. It is a harder project than independence, and independence was already the hardest thing most of these people had ever done. But there's something about a place that grew a plant from the Jurassic period, that kept a desert alive on fog when there was no rain, that survived a genocide and came back, that wrote a constitution overnight and made it stick, that recovered its elephants and its desert lions from near nothing with pure community stubbornness. There is something about a place like that that makes you reluctant to bet against it. Outside, the Benguela is rolling cold off the South Atlantic, and the fog is forming, Somewhere in the Namib, a fog beetle is doing a headstand. The dunes at Sossusvlei are doing what they always do, shifting, very slowly, in the wind, orange at sunrise, brick red by midday, purple in the last light. The skeleton coast is lined with its 1,000 ships. The Welwitschia is drinking from the air, same as it has for 1,000 years, same lineage as it had for 100 million. The elephants are moving through the Caprivi Strip toward the Zambezi. The Herero are tending their sacred fires. The oil field is there, 3,000 meters underwater, waiting to be decided about. And up in Windhoek, in the offices of a government that was elected by a country that fought for a century for the right to elect it, people are sitting down to argue about what comes next, which is, when you think about it, the only argument worth having. Hey, if you've made it this far, thank you. Genuinely. Drop a comment letting me know where you're listening from. And if you woke up and can't remember what country we just covered, that's fine. That's what this channel is for. Sleep well. We'll be back.